when it came to the options that I have with Loud House vs. Casagrandes projects, this was the least of what I wanted to do. Not to say that No Guts, No Glory is a waste of time, but considering that as the series progressed and when you look back into the Oreo episodes, which is this, and when you take into consideration that Chancla Force has the same formula as No Guts, No Glory, yeah, it really shows that people didn't enjoy No Guts, No Glory once they got back to it after binge watching the entire show. And for me personally, with this being one of the least videos I wanted to do, I want to get it out of the way, because if I ended up doing it later down the line, I would probably scrap it. You know, whenever I look at Chancla Force, by rethinking of what No Guts, No Glory would have been like if it was all a dream, it's really saying something that when the Casagrandes do a format similar to the Loud House, they slightly make it better, considering that most of the characters in this, aside from Carla and Rosa, are basically contribute less, but they're not dysfunctional compared to the Loud House. Like, you may say that they are, but the thing is, considering that in the Loud House episode, well, the characters have improved as the series progressed despite so many derailments, the Loud House, mainly the house itself, really feels like a huge obstacle at one point, but considering that a lot has changed as the series progressed, and I'm not talking about seasons 4 through present, I'm really starting to convince that a boy surviving 10 sisters, or in this case 9 sisters, is mainly a gimmick for what they're trying to do involving Lincoln's situation. But at the same time, the character development from the sisters as the series progressed just made this a lot more difficult to take Lincoln's problems seriously. And I'm not saying that because of the torture he went through, because this has nothing to do with him getting tortured. The plot of No Guts, No Glory is that when Linso and Rita are out of the house, Glori is in charge, and she took away everyone else's privileges, mainly the hobbies, and do what she says, otherwise she would instantly do something to them, mainly turning them into a human pretzel. Usually I would talk about Glori in this, considering that as the series progressed she has improved, but when it came to her being bossy, it's one thing that, on the fact that she is somewhat bossy in the later seasons, but in this episode, even though that's mainly part of her character, it really shows that if the series progressed and she was like this persona, I'm pretty sure that no one will probably like her, and she will probably be worse than Lola. In Chancla Force, due to Rosa and her chanclas, with the restrictions being enforced, Carla needs to find a way to get the chanclas away in order to have freedom in 2 of the apartments. You know, considering that Rosa and her chanclas have become a thing as the spin-off became a thing back in 2019, and the fact that Carla is the only character that came to this assumption that the chanclas are the reason onto why Rosa is mainly enforcing the restrictions. Yeah, this episode really feels like real-life parents that uses an object to use it for punishment against their children unless they do what they tell them to do. For me personally, as much as that this episode really feels a lot more over the top compared to the Loud House episode, that doesn't automatically mean that No Guts, No Glory is any better. In fact, judging of how people's perspective on this episode has changed over time, you can really tell that people prefer the newer episodes of Glori compared to these episodes of Glori. Since her motivation is to lay down the law to make sure that everything is under control, Mainly that the other characters aside from Lincoln is wreaking havoc without anyone in charge. I'm gonna be really honest with you, I would understand where she's coming from, but there is literally no reason to take away everyone else's happiness, considering that she is having her own happiness without anyone in the way. Like, if Rita and Lin So were in charge with one of them either leaving the house, they wouldn't lay down the law that hard. And this was around the time where we didn't get to see their faces, but they still are somewhat good parents if you started watching the show until you watch the rest. When it comes to Lincoln, I wouldn't say that he isn't terrible, but at the same time, he isn't good in this episode, considering that he's mostly a tool, and when the main character is mostly a tool for more involving enforcing restrictions for these characters and making sure that the house is completely clean, it really feels like that if you remember this episode while watching the rest of the episodes and the rest of the seasons, you see that the characters are a lot more likable in the newest seasons despite derailments, and they were a lot less likable in the earlier seasons. And believe me when I say this, I've heard about this criticism from fans and newer fans, considering that if you look at the earlier seasons compared to the later seasons, it really feels like that the first season is somewhat on the same levels of seasons 5 and 6, mainly the fact that when seasons 5 and 6 took ideals from the earlier seasons and have the characters revert back to square one after learning lessons that they ended up forgetting. This season felt more ignored compared to the later seasons, and even though that season 4 may have the following issues of reverting characters back, I'm gonna be really honest with you that season 4 was a lot more complicated, considering that in the later seasons where they tried to move forward, they still didn't even bother to move forward from anything from the first season. Which, for me personally, with this season being overshadowed by the later seasons, and the fact that seasons 2 and 3, despite with bad episodes, ended up becoming better seasons, it really feels like everything about the Loud House is a wild card, which, for me personally, of how people express on how learning lessons is really important, but at the same time, when they hammer it in, there was a reason onto why I can't be able to take every single episode really seriously, with the exception of a couple. If there's one thing notable about Chancla Force is that Ryan and Bobby isn't in this episode, considering that they're hanging out with their father's apartment. One of the reasons onto why Kara ends up becoming the main character in this despite having him getting more focus than the other characters is because I don't even think with this type of plot will work if Ryan and Bobby were the main characters by stopping Rosa and her Chanclas by enforcing the rules in order to have freedom for themselves. Granted, I still remember Breakfast Spot, but in all honesty, it really feels like that they actually knew what they were doing in this episode compared to that episode. And considering that Maria is part of the mayhem when the Chanclas are gone, I'm gonna be really honest with you, I may be disappointed that Maria isn't getting a lot of focus in the spin-off. But to be real with you, considering that she played video games with Rita, I'm starting to convince that she really misses a lot, knowing full well that she has less to worry about, considering that she gave birth to 2 children rather than 11. If I'm gonna be really honest with you, Maria's development, despite not being fleshed out as other characters, is nowhere near as complicated compared to Rita's. Now let's get into the havoc of 2 episodes. In No Guts, No Glory, everything is happening without the control of Glori in 5 minutes. I'm sorry, but I found that difficult to believe because If you remember my segment on the greenhouse and my Lincoln Loud Veil, how everything is literally happening in one day and I didn't believe that for a second, well, the same thing applies to here, except that it went way over the top. Maybe it's mainly for a joke, but considering of how poorly aged this episode is, I found any of this to be possible. Like, I'm aware that the Loud House is called the Loud House for a reason where it involves chaos, and I understand that this episode is all about chaos. In fact, I can totally understand that the chaos does come into play in some aspects of the Loud House. It's just that when fans criticize it, myself included sometimes, it's mainly of how far it went, and while this episode went as far, but it's nowhere near as bad as Brawl in the Family or the other instances. The issue is that judging of how poorly aged this episode is and the fact that we're supposed to look at the characters after they got developed, it really feels off-putting to see them like this, knowing full well that they were much more better as the series progressed. In comparison of Chancla Force, it really feels like with this taking place in a dream, this whole dream cliche actually works for the episode's benefit, knowing full well that it would probably be impossible for any of the other Casagrandes to act this way. Believe me when I say this. I know full well that the Casagrandes would not be complete maniacs like the Loud family. And considering that the adults in this episode, aside from Rosa, are really into the good life without any restrictions, I'm starting to convince that if Rita and Lin So were like this, they would have been a lot more worse. Mainly on Timmy tonal parents of how neglectful but also irresponsible they are. Like, I understand that people can't be able to take the adults seriously at times, but considering that this is all in a dream, unlike in the Loud House episode, it would have gotten much worse when the neighbors in the city, not town, would have listened to all the noise and havoc in one building. This episode just prevented more questions rather than raising questions. Let me tell you, this is one of the reasons onto why the Casagrandes, despite being too similar to the Loud House, is somewhat of a slightly better version of the Loud House for how the characters are much more developed and a lot more respected towards each other. Granted, the bad episodes are still there, and even though that there are negative aspects, but still, I actually felt like that whenever I look at these episodes in comparison of the Loud House, they can instantly do better by making all this a dream sequence or a cliche, and yet at the same time it works out because believe me, the criticisms I've heard involving it was all a dream, despite having valid points, has been really over the top that you can't be able to escape the criticism. And considering that this is the second episode that centers around Lincoln and Glori being together, when it comes to how toxic Glori was in the earlier seasons and how mixed Lincoln was in the first season, yeah, the humble beginnings really makes this episode difficult to take itself seriously at times. And when it comes to Glori, maybe this episode is supposed to be an indication of Glori getting along with Lincoln, which they do as the series progressed. But at the same time, considering that what Glori and Lincoln were doing through the final remaining minutes of this episode is just clean up the house, which is important considering that Lin, So, and Rita are returning. However, knowing full well that it just feels really cliched and not in the good reasons that I described in Chancla Force. Maybe there's a reason why people still considered Glori bossy in the later seasons, because with everyone in this episode, aside from Lincoln and Glori and the parents, they don't contribute to much other than enjoying the freedom, which for me personally, knowing full well that they just don't contribute much, other than just doing what they want, it really feels like Glori in this episode is mainly getting gift-wrapped due to plot convenience. I'm just saying, it really feels like Glori is getting gift-wrapped because the characters, aside from Lincoln and the parents, are being like this. Chaos or not, those should be a limit on the chaos in this show. Like, it's one thing to do that for a theme, for a cartoon, but considering that people have been getting into the characters a lot more and knowing forward that they're getting arcs of their own, the chaos nature in this show just doesn't work completely. And that's pretty much one of the reasons onto why people didn't enjoy the later seasons of The Loud House, mainly time-warped. Time-trapped, actually. And in all honesty, if I'm ever going to get into those episodes in the future, it's mainly of how I describe of how those episodes just don't work in the universe of The Loud House, and yet when they introduce the chaos element, they are just misusing it for plot convenience, or they're just using it for plot convenience. And when I say misuse for the first time, it's mainly the fact that they're just doing it for the sake of adding chaos and nothing more. You know, I understand that there's a difference of trying to be a thing and just trying to improve from being that thing. But at the same time, considering that there is no balance on just trying to do what a show should be like or what a show can improve on. But whenever I think about Chancla Force from the Casagrandes and the fact that it did a lot more better compared to the Loud House's No Guts, No Glori, maybe X fans have been way too harsh towards this spin-off. Like, if they actually compared these episodes to the Loud House episodes, which is what I'm doing right now, maybe they will probably see my point of view. Not completely, but at the same time, just nearly most of the examples that I discussed ever since I began this year of Loud House vs. Casagrandes projects. So anyway, Chancla Force from the Casagrandes is a better episode over No Guts, No Glori from the Loud House. Like, if you still enjoyed this episode, that's fine, but knowing full well how later on in the series where the characters improved, despite the derailments, you would probably see something in Chancla Force even though it's similar to No Guts, No Glori. Though then again, I've been doing this for way long, and at the same time, I have ideas and probably still making more ideas by chance. Believe me, I may be close to the end, but at the same time, you'll never know. I'm giving No Guts, No Glori a 4 out of 10, while Chancla Force gets a 6 out of 10.